Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Holocaust Memorial Day UCL lunch hour lecture. My name is Professor Alison Kozlowski, and I'm Pro-Provost Equity and Inclusion, as well as Co-Director of the Thomas Coram Research Unit in the UCL's Social Research Institute here at UCL. It's my honour and pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Anna Koch. Anna is a DAAD and Francis Carsten Lecturer in Modern German History at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies here at UCL. And I've worked with Francis Carsten's daughter, Janet Carsten, at the University of Edinburgh. So that's a nice link for me. Anna is the author of several books, including Home After Fascism, Italian and German Jews After the Holocaust. And she's also editor with Stephen Stach of Holocaust Memorial and the Cold War, Remembering Across the Iron Curtain. Home After Fascism received the 2025 British and Irish Association for Jewish Studies Book Prize and was also shortlisted for the 2025 Memory Studies Association First Book Award. So we're in for a treat today. Before we begin, I wanted to let you know that we will have some time at the end of the lecture for questions and that these can be submitted at any point during the talk by going to the Slido on your web browser, that's sli.duo, and entering the event code #survivors. I'm now going to hand over to Anna for the talk. Do enjoy.
Many thanks, Alison, for this introduction. And I would like to hear more about Francis Carsten's daughter later on. That's very interesting to me. So thank you for this very kind introduction. And thanks to everyone who made this event possible and for inviting me to give a talk today on the occasion of Holocaust Memorial Day. Now, most of you will know this, but I was also asked to make this talk very broad and sort of like sort of for not specialists in the history of the Holocaust. And actually, I often find that my students do not know this, so you may not know it. But Holocaust Memorial Day marks the liberation of Auschwitz on January 27th, 1945. And I'm showing you this slide that shows the liberation. It's from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, who makes, they make a lot of these sort of very, very good, I think, maps, but that gives us a bit of a sense of the geography. But what you can see here also is that Auschwitz was not the first camp to be liberated. It was made Danek in July 1944. It was also not the last camp to be liberated because there are other camps who were liberated later. The reason why Auschwitz, or the liberation of Auschwitz, has become, the day where we commemorate the Holocaust links to the sort of a general focus on Auschwitz within Holocaust memory. This is partly due because it was, the largest camp, and a large number of Jews were killed there, over 1 million. It was also a death camp and a forced labor and concentration camp. So unlike other extermination camps that were destroyed by the Nazis to hide evidence toward the end of the war, Auschwitz was captured mostly intact by the Soviets. And also for the same reason, because Auschwitz was a combined slave labor and death camp, thousands of people survived it, providing eyewitness accounts, memories, and testimonies. So a lot of the sources we have and a lot of the texts that have become to dominate public memory of the Holocaust, including Primo Levi's work, that I will talk about a little bit more later on, has sort of focused on Auschwitz, sort of creating this really sort of dominance, I guess, of Auschwitz as a symbol for the Holocaust. But it's sort of problematic in a number of ways, as scholars of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union will point out. Partially because it privileges a Western perspective. So many of the Jews who were deported and survived Auschwitz came from Western Europe, including, again, Primo Levi. And so it skews our public perception somewhat to how Jews experience the Holocaust. It also very much sort of forces our viewpoint to this sort of notion of an industrial genocide. But there's been a lot of research in the last decades that have pointed to the ways in which Jews were killed across Europe, and not all of them were brought to camps. So there's a lot of research now on, for instance, the Holocaust by bullets. and the shootings that happened in the Soviet Union and parts of Europe. So what we need to remember, I guess, or what I'm saying is that this sort of lecture that I'm giving is only talking about a very specific experience of a very specific group of people within a much wider history of the Holocaust. And I obviously can't touch on all of this today. But the Nazis and their collaborator killed Jews across Europe in different ways. And a focus on Auschwitz so can flatten our understanding of the Holocaust in a sense. But as I said, this talk, or as you know from the title, this talk focuses on Italian Jews, most of whom were sent to Auschwitz, and some of their survivors were liberated there in January, among them Primo Levi. So in this sense, that date is very fitting for my research and my focus here. Still, this date, the focus on the Day of Liberation, frames this history in a particular and perhaps in some ways problematic way. In cultural representations of the Holocaust, liberation is often depicted as a moment of celebration. Think about movies such as Schindler's List, Life is Beautiful, or many other films. But few survivors experience liberation as a moment of pure joy. Some did not know they had been liberated, they were too ill. Others were not liberated in Auschwitz, even if they had been interned there. This is because Jews had been forced to march westwards to escape their allies on the so-called death marches. So they were essentially pushed from these camps in Eastern Europe towards the camp on German soil. And that's also the reason why many Jews were liberated in places such as Dachau or Buchenwald, even though they hadn't been interned there for most of the war. Many died on these marches, so really towards the end of the war. Those who survived were liberated in these camps in Germany, but many of them died after liberation. And again, it's very difficult to give exact numbers. We cannot know for sure how many Jews were liberated in the various camps and how many survived. But historians estimate that there were about 90,000 Jews liberated in camps on German soil. About 20,000 of them died in the following weeks, so after their liberation. All this is not to say, of course, that the liberation of Auschwitz was not a crucial or important moment, or that it did not matter. Of course it did. What I'm trying to say is that we need to be careful with the term liberation and the imagery it awakens in us, because it's not as simple as horror before and joy after, not for the survivors. And as historians, of course, part of what we do, right, we have this messiness of the past, and we need to find starting points and endpoints for the histories we tell. And it makes sense that many histories of the Holocaust end with the liberation of the camps, right? It seems like a natural ending point. But again, for survivors, this does not necessarily make sense in the way they tell this history or they account their personal experiences. Siggy Wilczek, for instance, who was liberated at Mauthausen in May 1945, commented, quote, "Who really knows what happened on the day of liberation? Who of us had the strength at 70 or 80 pounds to know?" Like Wilczek, other survivors recollect their sense of disorientation. Anna Koch, an Italian Jew who was arrested while attempting to cross the Swiss border and deported to Auschwitz, remembered, quote, "We were free, but no one moved. I had no idea where to go. I didn't even know where I was. And if I go out, where do I go? Do I go forward? Do I go backwards? Do I go left? Do I go right?" Without papers, without working trains, without maps and directions, freedom meant little. In any case, most survivors were too weak to leave their camps. One survivor suggested that after liberation they were, quote, "neither free nor prisoners. We were liberated." And another termed them half-free. Such sentiments were shared widely among survivors who very rarely perceived liberation as an endpoint of their struggles. So what this talk then is trying to do is pick up the history at the point where it usually ends, at liberation, and focus in particular, and this is because this is where a lot of my research comes from, on Italian Jews and their return journeys. a lot of these sort of experience and sentiments that I share in this talk of Italian Jews, they can be applied to Holocaust survivors more widely. And I'm using here Holocaust survivors, the term in a really narrow way. So people who were liberated in Nazi camps. But Italian Jews differ from many survivors from other places in Central Eastern and Eastern Europe, primarily in the fact that they almost all wanted to go back to Italy, and they wanted to do so as quickly as possible. And so, what I'm going to talk about now in the next half hour or so is their various accounts of their return journeys. The Germans had deported over 6,800 Italian Jews, of whom about 1,009 returned, and almost all of them had been deported to Auschwitz. There were about 200 survivors who were liberated there. Others survived the death marches and were liberated in Theresienstadt, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, or other smaller camps in Germany or Austria. And some were left in the middle of nowhere, and then the S-Guards fled the advancing Red Army, like Giuliana Fiorentino Tedeschi, who remembers that the Germans, quote, lost their head and left them behind when they're marching from Ravensbrück to a smaller subcamp. So here you see sort of like, again, a different map, it's sort of including now Italy. In partially, I'm showing this map in order to underline that most of these Italian Jewish survivors were liberated really quite far from their homes. And the other thing that is sort of, I think, becomes very visible when you look at it is sort of the transportation of a vast number of people across really wide distances. It's sort of bringing all these people from all over Europe to these places such as Auschwitz. And this transportation, it arguably forms a distinctive feature of the Holocaust within the wider history of genocides. And survivors such as Levi and others like Charlotte Delbo, Elie Wiesel, Ruth Klüger have written about the horrors of the deportation trains that brought them to the camps. Historian Simone Gigliotto uses such testimonies, among other sources, to examine victims' experiences during the different stages of transit in a 2009 book, The Train Journey. So this book looks at not at the journey that I'm looking at today, but at the other journey, the journey to the camp. And in this book, she sheds light on, quote, the trauma of deportation as a human crime with inhuman impact, and sort of really shows how these sort of traumatic experiences begins with these journeys there. Trains and cattle cars also play a really central role in the public imagination of the Holocaust, and they play a central role in museum exhibitions, as this one here at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, which, as far as I know, wasn't actually a train was used, but is sort of an example of how these trains looked like. Again, we need to be careful here not to homogenize the experiences of victims and not to flatten the history of the Holocaust. Scholars such as Tim Cole have shown the varied ways in which Jews were transported to the camps, not all in trains. So again, we have this imagery of the modern genocide and everybody is transported in trains, but people were transported in as much smaller vehicles as well, in much simpler methods. And again, we also need to bear in mind that in vast parts of Eastern Europe, Jews were killed close to where they lived rather than transported elsewhere. But still, many people were transported and moved, and often several times, right? Sort of like people were sent to one camp, is in some of these examples already mentioned, and then sent to march to different camps where they liberated or they were moved around even during the internment experiences. So a focus on the journeys to and from the camps underlines the immense geographical scale of the Holocaust spanning across Europe and beyond. And trains remained important also because of a primary mode of transportation in the return journeys of survivors. So of course these trains were different and took on different meanings. So this photograph of Jewish children liberated from Buchenwald awakens very different emotions in us than the, sort of the imagery of the Holocaust train we usually have. It's a hopeful picture in many ways, both because they're leaning out and they're smiling in us, but also because of the writing on the chain where it says Hitler kaputt, so, Hitler destroyed or broken, quite literally. Yet while the image captures a joyous moment, we need to bear in mind that these were deeply traumatized children whose parents had been killed. They were sent to France because these were essentially orphan children in Buchenwald camp, and they're sent to different orphanages in Western Europe. So this talk that is primarily based on survivors' accounts of their return journeys sort of emphasizes these in many ways contradictory elements that sort of are part of these accounts of these return journeys. So both liberation and the limitations of freedom, violence and some joy and hope, the return home and the lasting trauma of the camps. These accounts also highlight the dissonance between the dreams and expectations of liberation and the subsequent disappointments and disillusionments of survivors. Levy, who had been encouraged by the modest success of the republication of If This a Man in 1958, it was not a book that was particularly successful when it was first published after the war. So anyhow, he republished it in 1958. And then it gets a bit more attention. So he decides to write a sequel. It depicts his return from Auschwitz to Turin, published as La Tregua, The Truce, in 1963. And so here he writes, quote, "Liberty, the improbable, the impossible liberty, so far removed from Auschwitz that we had only dared to hope for it in our dreams, had come, but it had not taken us to the promised land. It was around us, but in the form of a pitiless, deserted plain. More trials, more toil, more hunger, more cold, more fears awaited us." Some Italian Jewish survivors had hoped and dreamt that they would be picked up and brought back home. Liana Milieu, like Levi, a writer who was liberated from Machau, a subcamp of Ravensbrück in May 1945, recounts her return journey in her 1978 memoir, I Ponti di Schwerin, The Bridges of Schwerin. She writes that she had hoped for a triumphant return, one that would, quote, "delete the memories of the forced journey from Italy to Germany." So she links here these sort of both journeys, and she hopes that her return journey could sort of delete or overcome these sort of traumatic memories of the journey to the camps. But as in Milo's case, such hopes are mostly shattered, and survivors depict a sense of loss and abandonment at liberation. And of course, the liberation of Auschwitz preceded the end of war in May 1945, so initially making a return to Italy across the front line impossible in any case. But even after the war had ended, return remained challenging. The Italian post-war state faced immense difficulties in repatriating the mass of displaced Italian citizens, of whom Jewish deputies formed only a small percentage. And it's important to remember a number of things here. So first of all, the massive numbers of displaced people roamed the European continent at the end of the war. These are estimates again, but about 65 million people had been forced to leave their homes during the war. So they were forced laborers, former prisoners of wars, citizens whose home had been bombed, German expellees from Eastern Europe. So there's a massive amount of people who are trying to travel across this continent that is, of course, also destroyed, right? So there's destruction of transportation and communication networks, which impedes an easy return. There was also no particular emphasis or interest in bringing Jewish survivors home. So in the immediate aftermath of the war, the way we think about the Holocaust now is this sort of specific crime within World War II that wasn't the same. Jews were just considered another group of many victims with no particular status. The term Holocaust was not used at all at the time. So all of this is to say that there was no kind of proper program to bring, sort of like by the Italian post-war state, to bring these Jewish survivors home. Some were lucky and received speedy assistance, and some were even flown back with military airplanes of the Royal Air Force, like Zoe Lust, who made it to Bucharest after her liberation from Auschwitz and arrived in Napoli in June 1945. But very few were as lucky. Like Lust, David Soria was first sent to Bucharest, but rather than being repatriated from there, he, like many other Italian Jewish survivors, including Levi, was sent to Odessa. An initial plan existed, or seems to have existed, to bring these survivors back to Italy via ship. But the ship never arrived, and the survivors had to travel back across Europe via train. They traveled for months with various stops. In some cases, their health deteriorated during the long and strenuous journey. And for some, facing this return journey proved in any case impossible until months after liberation. The then 16-year-old Piero Terracina, for instance, was liberated in Auschwitz, but he was too weak to travel home. Instead, he was brought to a Russian military hospital and later to a sanatorium at the Black Sea. While in the sanatorium in Sochi, he wrote to Pietro Caroni, the Italian ambassador in Moscow, asking for assistance. The letter, written in April 1945, reveals the boy's loneliness. Piero explained that he had been deported with his siblings and parents, and that his parents had been murdered in the camps. He continued, quote, "I haven't spoken a word in Italian for about 40 days. I still don't speak Russian, so all I do is stay in bed all day, and 1,000 thoughts are going through my head. I think a lot about my family. I cry, but then I console myself, hoping to be able to see at least my brothers and my sister again. It brought me much comfort, Ambassador, if you answered. Remember that it's a boy who writes you." Quaroni replied, and a correspondence between Piero and the ambassador ensued. The letter could ultimately do little to speed up Piero's return, and the boy was one of the last returnees and only arrived in Rome in December 1945. Still, the young survivor felt grateful for the ambassador's attention and encouragement. Some Jewish survivors returned to Italy as early as May 1945, others as late as March 1946. The last Italian Jew to return was Arminio Waxberger. He had been deported to Auschwitz with his wife and young daughter, who were both killed upon arrival. Arminio survived the camp and the death marches to Dachau. After liberation, he took a position in the administration of the Felderfing DP camp, so this was a displaced person camp in the south of Germany. There he met an Hungarian Jewish survivor who soon became his wife, and you see him here on this photograph with his wife and their daughter. The family moved to Italy in 1949. I'm not sure whether they had always planned to go to Italy when the DP camp closed, or if they had other immigration plans while they were there, but Waxberger is an exception among Italian Jews, who, as I mentioned earlier, almost all wanted to return as soon as possible and did not linger in these displaced person camps in Germany. And so, because they were eager at their home, they soon get tired of the endless waiting and the length it took for them to get home. After the ship never arrived, Primo Levi and his group eventually arrived at the displaced person camp near Staia d'Oroghi. And this is a map that is sort of printed in La Trigua, but here someone made a sort of more, a color version of this that sort of like shows Levi's trek from Auschwitz back home, and you really see how wide and how far he moves across Europe, and also in how sort of not at all a direct line back to his home, because they were brought to these random places like Staia d'Oroghi, which was a different displaced persons camp. They spent about 2 months there waiting. They did not know when or how they would be sent home. As Levi writes, quote, whoever fully understood why we were at Staia d'Oroghi and what we were doing there. Rumors spread at some point that they may be first to work in the kolkhoz, which were easily believed, since several liberated prisoners at different points had been pulled into Soviet work commanders. Control over their fate remained limited. Survivors depict the challenges of navigating a chaotic and unpredictable environment where various forces, from aid organizations to soldiers, helped but also hindered their return. They often felt, in Levi's words, quote, blown by the wind, dependent on the fickleness of a distant, unknown, erratic will. So a lot of these decisions, they didn't quite make sense of them, right? Sort of, and they didn't know why they were sent to these various places. The return narratives shed light on the limits of survivors' agency. They often were moved from one camp to another, seemingly at random. Liberation did not mean freedom, or at least not in a simplistic way. And though both men and women faced abuse, uncertainty, chaotic conditions, hunger and cold, The threat of sexual violence separated them. Livy depicts the frequent sexual barter in various transit camps as well as prostitution, and at several points he insinuates the threat of rape. But he reports these events from a distance. They did not involve him. Female survivors, in contrast, highlight the almost constant fear of sexual assault. So in her memoir, his fellow writer Liana Milou depicts in a harrowing passage of her memoir how a stranger raped her in a farmhouse where she and her travel companion found shelter just a few days after the liberation. In Fausta Fincey's memoir, news about the end of the war disappears into the background, overshadowed by assault. On their way to the American zone, she and her travel companion stayed in a house in Neustadt-Glewe, so that's in the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany. She recounts how Russian soldiers broke into the house. One, quote, took Mara to the first room. Meanwhile, Livia runs down to call up Paul, who lives below, but as soon as the Russian sees him, he points his revolver at him and chases him away. Mara is in the soldiers' hands and calls for help, but no one can help her. Liberation did not come with safety. Still, the women kept going. What else could they do? Violence, anxiety, fear, and an inability to control their fate mark survivors' stories of return. But there are other elements in these stories too. They emphasize their resourcefulness and they highlight regaining a sense of freedom at small moments when they decide to turn around, not follow a larger group, and make their own decisions in their own way. Levy's The Truce's most joyous moment is perhaps the part in which he and his companion decide to defy the Russian soldiers who bring them from one camp to another. They split and find shelter for the night and manage, after much struggle, to communicate with locals to buy a chicken in a nearby village. We are free. We felt free, Levy writes. On her way back to Florence, Anna Di Gioacchino and her travel companions also decided to split and to make it on their own, after a seemingly endless journey with quite a few detours. Anna Di Gioacchino had been deported to Auschwitz on January 30, 1944, together with her husband Nathan. She survived the internment and the transfer to Theresienstadt, where she was liberated in May 1945. And together with other survivors, Anna then set out on the long journey home. They went to Prague, where they were hosted by the Italian consulate and promised a speedy return. However, their train, heading originally to Linz, was redirected to Vienna. Anna and the others in her group were told to wait in the Wiener Neustadt camp for their repatriation. After 5 weeks, they were transported to Hungary. Anna and 3 others then decided to try reaching Graz. Following the advice of a chance acquaintance, they head to the Hungarian-Yugoslav borders and take a train to Ljubljana. From there, they're supposed to then go to another refugee camp, but at this point they decide to try to make it back on their own. And so they take a train to Trieste, crossing the border without any documents. And for once, gender bias works in the women's favor, as Anna wrote in a letter in August 1945. I'm quoting from this letter. Another night spent in a station taking the train in the morning for Trieste. I cannot tell you the excitement in crossing the border. An American got on to check documents, but only the men's. So we entered with no difficulty. It was like a dream. It was the 1st of August. At some point on their journey, probably when they were at the Wiener Neustadt camp, Anna and her friend had their picture taken. The photograph shows the 3 of them, Anna, Amelia Navarro, and Enrica Zafati, standing arm in arm. It differs from the pictures of weak, emaciated survivors unaware of the camera that were widespread in the press at the time and still sort of like, I guess, dominate the imagery of Holocaust survivors. And it's part of the reason I really like this photograph is because the women appear to be in charge. They stand united, strong, and smiling. They look directly in the camera. And if not for the destroyed houses in the background, it could be a vacation photograph. The women could have stood in front of a tree or a house that didn't have its roof blown off, but they had that picture taken surrounded by ruins, their white shirts contrasting against the dark background. And I don't know whether it was their choice or what prompted them to take the picture against this surrounding. Photographs, as Roland Barthes writes, quote, establish an awareness of the object of the picture having been there. Just weeks after their liberation, this simple proof of existence takes on extraordinary meaning. They had survived against all odds. They were still there, standing, while around them the world had collapsed. In the face of serious constraints, lack of papers, violence, destroyed infrastructure, and chaos, the survivors navigated their surroundings as best as they could. In accounts of their return, they often emphasize the ability to make choices, to be someone who can make choices. This ability to make choices, to have agency, forms a crucial part of our understanding what it means to be human. And in the accounts of their return journey, survivors comment often also on this process of reclaiming their humanity. Such reflections often mirror depictions of the dehumanization which start with the violent journey to the camps. Levi, in his If This Is a Man, so the first memoir he publishes after the war, recalls being part of the, quote, 650 pieces, Stücke, so he refers it to the German term, loaded onto 12 goods wagons in early 1944, men, women, and children pressed together without pity, like cheap merchandise for a journey towards nothingness, a journey down there towards the bottom. So referring to pieces or Stücke, Levi uses this Nazi terminology to sort of underline the extent to which Nazis depicted them not as human, as in Levi, and treated them not as human, as Levi's words, cheap merchandise. This term the Nazis used, Stücke, comes up in other accounts as well. For instance, in Alexander Koch's account, Koch, who was deported from Trieste in April 1944 and liberated in Natzweiler Struthof in April 1945, explains that he forgot how to behave, how to eat in the camps, and he continues, I'm quoting, "We had become what the Germans wanted, Stücke." He continues, quote, "Slowly I took back human and social characteristics. That was my return." So he sort of reflects both on sort of the dehumanization and his sort of effort to reclaim his humanity as part of his return. And more broadly in their return stories, survivors quite often stress how they reclaim their sense of humanity, their sense of themselves. But they depict this as a slow and often a painful process. Social connections, the ability to converse with someone or to express themselves, played a crucial role in this effort to restore their sense of self in the days and months following liberation. Levi recounts his first conversations outside the camp with strangers as a crucial step in regaining a sense of self. And Liana Milou highlights the importance of her diary, which provided, quote, better nourishment than anything else. When I wrote, perhaps today is the 3rd of May, that was a big moment. I could still write. And again, this also gives us a sense of the survivor's disorientations, but also here Milo's effort to resituate herself within time, right? Sort of within a more normal time. Perhaps today is the 3rd of May, she writes. On their return journey, survivors also reclaimed their sense of their body, their masculinity and femininity, which they robbed or suppressed during the Holocaust. Natalia Tedeschi remembers that she and her companions received some money from an Italian aid organization and they were on their way to Prague. I'm quoting again. "So what did we decide? To buy a lipstick. Ugly as we were, we wanted to restore our femininity." Yet an increased sense of the self came with the beginning of an effort to process what had happened to them and a fear about what they would find upon their return. Levi explains that the suffering that most occupied him in the camp was animal-like, the lack of food, cold, pain. This changed after liberation. He writes, quote, "In the very hour in which every threat seemed to vanish, in which a hope of a return to life ceased to be crazy, I was overcome as if a dike had crumbled by a new and greater pain. The pain of exile, of my distant home, of loneliness, of friends lost, of youth lost, and of the host of all corpses all around." Others similarly highlighted during their return journey the pain of what had happened to them and the fear of what had happened to their loved ones grew. The fear of destroying their hope became more acute the closer they got to their homes. Liana Milou writes of her impending return in her diary with sadness, quote, "We will live in 15 days, almost desperation, coming back sick with nothing and no one." Toward the end of his literary memoir, Levi depicts the moment in which he and his companions, after months of traveling, finally crossed the Brenner. They had been, so the Brenner, that's the border between Italy and Austria. So crossing back into Italy. They had been waiting and hoping for this moment, but there is little joy or excitement in his words. Leonardo and I remained lost in silence, crowded with memories. We knew that on the thresholds of our homes, for good or ill, a trial awaited us, and we anticipated it with fear. The months just passed over a heart of wandering on the margins of civilization now seemed to us like a truce, a parenthesis of unlimited availability, a providential but irrepeatable gift of fate. Levi describes the return journey as a gift of fate, as a brief pause between the horrors of the camps and the arrival home burdened by lasting trauma. Other survivors depict their journey in similar ways, as an interim time, a liminal space between Auschwitz and what came after. Some delayed the final return, unwilling to leave this liminal space of the return journey behind. And indeed, in many cases, the return was painful. Many, if not most of the people I briefly mentioned in this talk found that they were the only ones to return, like Piero, the young boy who wrote to the Italian ambassador. Piero, the youngest of 4 siblings, was the only survivor of his family. He remembers that, quote, "When I arrived in Italy, I felt alone, burdened by loneliness." Anna di Gioacchino Cossuto returned in July 1945, and she then learned that her youngest daughter had died, but their other children had survived in hiding. Anna then tried desperately to gather information of her husband, Nathan Cossuto, from whom she had been separated upon arrival in Auschwitz, and listed of a number of letters I have of Anna writing with other survivors, trying to find a trace, but she's unable to do so. And she eventually had to accept that Nathan would not return. And so looking at these women and thinking about what they went through and their ability to keep on walking through this war-torn continent, I think we often can't help but feel in awe of them. There's a danger, however, that we turn these stories of survival into redemptive narratives where survivors cross Europe and move from the dark to the light. Such a narrative, moving from the east to the west, also matches a Cold War framework, which in problematic ways has shaped the history and memory of the Holocaust. Holocaust films and representation, which depict the liberation as a moment of joy and as the end of suffering, often contribute to such a comforting history of Western Europe, leaving violence, genocide, and fascism behind. We need to be wary, however, of simplistic narratives that depict liberation as an endpoint, suggesting a neatness in the move from internment under horrific conditions to freedom that rarely matches the accounts of survivors. We may be tempted to focus on the day of liberation as an endpoint of pain and suffering, to add an uplifting, comforting endpoint to this history. But there's nothing comforting in the history of the Holocaust. The Holocaust scholar Lawrence Langer discusses the problematic role of terms such as liberation in his work on testimony, suggesting that, quote, "Words like survival and liberation, with their root meanings of life and freedom, allow us to push aside the violence, the lasting trauma and devastation. Such a viewpoint," quote, "invites us to adapt the Holocaust experience to ideas of heroism during the event and a process of recovery afterward that are inconsistent with the realities of the disaster." Such simplistic stories fail to grapple with the specific historical context and conditions that made the Holocaust possible, and to consider the long-term and devastating effects on survivors and societies more broadly in the aftermath. In a recent work fittingly titled "The Holocaust and Unfinished History," historian Dan Stern highlights this lasting effect of the genocide, focusing primarily on Central and Eastern Europe. And Italian Jewish communities may have remained somewhat more intact than others elsewhere, but here the Holocaust did not end in May 1945. It's crucial to consider the history of the aftermath and to examine how the legacies of fascist and Nazi violence shaped the post-war period. Levi's novel was first published in English as The Reawakening, which seems to me a mistranslation. In Levi's eye, the journey was a truce, an intermittence. What Levi tells is not a reawakening from the camp, but a testament to the lasting trauma. The book on either end is framed by his retelling of a recurring nightmare in which he wakes up in Auschwitz. So the book begins with this poem, and it ends, again, I'm not reading the poem out, and it ends also with Levi retelling this dream. So just for you to know, Stavach not so good in Polish, but it means get up. So it was sort of the command told to prisoners in the morning. So he starts the book with his poem that focuses on this phrase, and then he concludes the book with a retelling of the same dream. I'm quoting. A dream full of horror still not ceased to visit me, at sometimes frequent, sometimes longer intervals. I'm sitting at a table with my family or with friends or at work or in the green countryside, in short in a peaceful, relaxed environment, apparently without tension or affliction. Yet I feel a deep and subtle anguish, the definite sensation of an impending threat. And in fact, as the dream proceeds slowly and brutally, each time in a different way, everything collapses and disintegrates around me. The scenery, the walls, the people, while the anguish becomes more intense and more precise. Now everything has changed into chaos. I'm alone in the center of a grey and turbid nothing. And now I know what this thing means. And I also know that I have always known it. I'm in the lager once more, and nothing is true outside the lager. All the rest of us, lager meaning camp, all the rest of us all the rest was a brief pause, a deception of the senses, a dream, my family, nature, my home. Now this inner dream, this dream of peace is over, and in the outer dream which continues, a well-known voice resounds, a single word, not imperious but brief and subdued. It is a dawn command of Auschwitz, a foreign word, feared and expected. Get up, steh wach. Framing the book in this way, with these two accounts, seems to point to the perpetuity of Levi's sense of remaining in or consistently returning to Auschwitz. Other survivor accounts mirror Levi's words, perhaps not as poetically. Simply picking up their lives before persecution proved impossible. That they could return physically to the city's town, villages, and homes, they could not go back to the time before their deportation and the murder of their loved ones. For survivors, at least for some of them, return proved impossible, and liberation, in a sense, remained elusive. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Anna. Thank you for this rich, moving, and informative lecture on this Holocaust Memorial Day. We're going to turn now to the audience for questions, and if I could encourage everybody to pop their questions on Slido. You should find the link in your Eventbrite pack if you haven't found it, or if you go to sli.do and then the event on #survivors. Have a first question from Miles, Anna, who asks, what is known about the returnees, how they funded their travel back to Italy?
Okay, so there was no sort of the general funding organization, right? So they had to essentially fund themselves, but they did get assistance sometimes, right? So, and again, this is sort of would be different for different individuals. Some people did get to an Italian embassy who did help them and assist them, sort of like Becky's women who get money to pay for their lipstick and other things as well. A lot of soldiers were were moved by the Soviet army and like Levy for a long time, so he didn't have to pay for his transport. But initially, he doesn't have shoes and he needs to organize them for himself, and nobody buys them for him. So it was messy, really, and it would be different for different people. And there was no sort of and most of them just had to make do with what they had. So Liana Milou in the beginning, she has sort of absolutely nothing. And she kind of like sometimes she finds like a house that has been abandoned and she finds some food there. So, but yeah.
Thank you. Another question's come in from Leonardo. And how about after their return? How did they deal with the psychological impacts of their experiences? Were most able to recover?
Okay, so this is a big and difficult question, right? That is sort of like in stories of trauma, and many were not, right? Sort of, I think for a lot of survivors, this is such a traumatic experience. And also, I guess, what does it mean to recover? A lot of people did leave like sort of like normal lives, but then they also talk about this always stays with him, like Piero Tragino. He becomes eventually initially has nothing. He becomes a manager for an Italian company, and then a lot of them become really active in Holocaust education, like he does, sort of like giving speeches and stuff. But he talks about the fact that he's never, he could never get over this loss of his family. Like most of you know, Primo Levi committed suicide, as did other Holocaust survivors, such as Shauna Marie, for instance. So for many people, I don't think there was sort of a recovery in the full sense. They were also not welcomed with open arms upon their arrival. There was no specific, sort of consideration um, given to them, neither in Italy nor elsewhere, right? So it's not like, oh, these people have gone through a traumatic experience. We would need to help them and assist them. It took a long time for them to gain any sort of assistance at all.
Yeah. I'm going to slip in a question of my own before I go to the next person's question. And I was struck by the concept of home that you use and how this interacts with the concept of return. So did people find home on their return? Um,
Yeah. I mean, right, because home is not only a place, but it's also people. A lot of them did not, because others people did not come back. Some people moved sort of to other places in Italy or so. Some did. And they write about sort of, the relief of being in their place. And some of them did have other family who ever returned or survived. So again, these would be different for different people. But there's this very famous um, essay by Jean Marie, who is not an Italian, but an Austrian Holocaust survivor. It's called How Much Home Does a Person Need? And there he sort of grapples with that exact question. And he sort of, says that for them, right, he could not return to home because home had been destroyed. Sort of that concept of his home, what he considered home, that didn't exist anymore. And he also makes the point about how important it is to have a home for a person. So he talks about this, yeah, difficulty. And it of course links also to sort of the way people felt about Italy. And so again, this was different for different survivors, that they had been deported because they'd been betrayed by neighbors or so. And it would have an impact of how they felt upon their return. So people who came back and they said, oh, I did go back to Italy because this is my language and this is where I came from, but I can't feel at home here anymore because of the history of fascism. But there were others who remembered moments of rescues in the system and who felt differently about this.
Thank you. Another question's come in. Were there many children on the return journey? If so, how was the process of dealing with it different for them?
Okay, so very few, right? Because most children were killed immediately upon arrival in the camp. So the number of Italian Jewish children who survived is, I mean, it's under 100. It's like I think I could look it up, and I'm not so good with numbers, but it's I somewhere have the names of these children, so it's maybe 20 or so. It's so few. Um, the few Italian Jewish children who survived, some of them survived because they were in places where they did medical experiments. And they, with children, there generally was an effort to sort of like some organization transport, like in that picture I showed initially of these children from Buchenwald who were primarily Polish and some Hungarian Jewish child survivors. And so there were Jewish relief organization, in this case, a Swiss Jewish relief organization that organized transport for them in this train to bring them to a specific orphanage in France. So I think there were sort of relief organizations which did try to help. It's also like the Red Cross, for instance, and a number of relief organizations and assistance. I tried to help various displaced people, including Jews and especially children. But there were also a lot of displaced children roaming across Europe, and Jews were a very small number among them, just because most of them had been killed.
Thank you. Another question is, Anna, you mentioned the word Holocaust was not used or not mentioned at the start of the post-war period. When did people start being horrified?
I think people started being horrified pretty much right after, because there were these pictures of the camps that of their allies, they liberate the camps and they film it or they take photographs, and these are then go across the press in 1945. So people were aware of the I don't know, massacres and then of the genocide and the violence and the camps. It took some time, but pretty soon after the liberation, but they didn't have a specific word for that yet. And the term Holocaust is really starts to be used much more prominently in the 70s after the TV show Holocaust with Meryl Streep comes out. Before that, there are other terms like Shoah in Hebrew and Kurban in Yiddish that are used by survivors. And survivors are clear from the beginning that something specific has happened to the Jewish people and they're trying to write this history. But for a lot of people from outside the Jewish community, they're sort of among the many victims of the war.
Thank you. I had another question around whether you could say a bit more about your sources that you use in your book, so that you draw upon the letters and the photos. How do you? I'm not a historian. How do you go about finding your sources?
So a lot of my sources, because I'm sort of really interested in how these people tell their story of liberation, return, arrival, and then the book talks a lot more about these conceptions of home and what happens after the arrival and how they experience the arrival and these things, and then also about of the memory and the commemoration, the initial commemoration of how people who came back remembered and mourned after the war. So I use printed memoirs and diaries. There is a wonderful archive in Italy, it is just an archive of diary and memoirs where people, sort of quote unquote ordinary people send in their memories and diaries, and they have a lot of Italian Jews also. And then I use a lot of sources from community archives, so Jewish community archives. Where you can find, letters written to the Jewish community after the war asking for assistance. And then you can also sometimes find these letters of survivors. So when survivors come back, once they return, a lot of people, especially in Italy, where relative many Jews had survived within the country, they all go to the survivors and start asking them because they want to know what happened to their relatives. And there's also a lot of letters sent then to survivors, but also survivors writing to other survivors trying to find their relatives. So I have these letters too, and a lot of them are luckily kept in community archives.
Fascinating. Question from Abigail. How does modern Italy understand and grapple with its wartime history and the Holocaust today?
Ooh, that's a big question. Thank you. Um, But it's complicated as these sort of stories of commemoration often are. So Italy also commemorates Giorno della Memoria. So in January 27, there was a debate in Italy whether there should be a commemoration of a more specific Italian date, like the roundup of the Jews in Rome or the issuing of the fascist racial legislations in 1938, but they did decide to commemorate. And so there's a lot of Holocaust memory, like as in a lot of places. What there is not so much, um, especially, I guess, under the current government, is sort of a grappling with the history of fascism and the role Italian collaboration played in the um, deportation and persecution of Jews. So Italy issued racial laws in 1938, so before the German occupation. And a lot of Italian policemen in Italian, the Germans could not have deported all the Jews without the assistance of, collaborators in Italy as elsewhere. So that there is a lot of sort of collaboration. And after the war, Italy, like lots of places, focused sort of on its history of resistance and on stories of rescues, and the sort of general term used for is so the myth of the good Italian, the myth of the brava gente. So the idea that Italians had been in contrast to the Germans, good during the war, had saved Jews, had resisted, had basically opposed fascism. So it's a myth that historians have started to break down since the 1980s, but it still holds, people hold on to it because it's always, better to think about the histories of rescuers rather than the histories of, well, you'd rather think about the histories of rescuers than of perpetrators, I suppose.
Absolutely. I suppose building on that question around how should historians think about or how do we perpetuate sort of Holocaust Memorial Days in over the next 10-year period or 20-year period? and what do you see your role in that as also bringing on new historians?
In sort of kind of creating Holocaust Memorial Day,
Yeah, yeah,
like what historians' role should be within it. I think
exactly.
one thing is that with the, and that I think it's sort of like the one thing that historians can do is share their research, which I try to do here. But there are many historians, as I said in the beginning, there's a lot of misconceptions. I think there's a lot of Holocaust memory, but there is not necessarily a lot of knowledge about the Holocaust, which is sort of this art, yeah. I mean, it's sort of like yeah, this dissonance almost. So it's sort of the way we think about Holocaust in the public imagination is not necessarily how it happened. And then commemoration often sort of focuses on sort of like this sort of redemptive narrative, right? Something about hatred, and they're very vague and not very concrete. So I think bringing on the research that makes it more specific and more specifically talks about what actually happened to people, what were the role of, collaborators, and what were the circumstances that allowed this to happen in the first place, I think is quite important.
Absolutely. I wonder what the role is for thinking about schools and curriculum as well, so that young people coming through now, 80 years on, still learn about the Holocaust in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of, this is not really sort of my research, but the UCL Institute for Education, they have done some brilliant surveys about what do school children know about the Holocaust, and it's really interesting, right? Sort of the way they reconceptualize it, and you sort of see a lot of these misconceptions. So I think in recent decades, there's a so they ask questions, so for instance, who were the victims of the Holocaust, and they're sort of like you can see how clearly people think about Jews from Western Europe, but they also think about other persecuted groups, such as homosexuals who were persecuted, but they were not killed in death camps, and it's sort of like a, but they don't think at all, for instance, about Soviet prisoners of war who they're the first people who were gassed in Auschwitz. So is the Cold War remains sort of, I think, a strong framework of how the history of the Holocaust is taught. And then the other thing that I think people focus really a lot on in Britain um, is education of the Kindertransport, which was important and an important moment in many ways, but again, it sort of leads to a flattening and I guess a self-flattering perception of we saved these children without asking about migration laws more broadly, about the parents of those children who were not allowed in, and it also often then leads to these sort of like flat statements that talk about where politicians on the one hand can talk about the kinder transport and all the good that has done, and then the next day talk about immigrants in a very negative way or like closing borders and all of that. So I think there's again sort of an often very problematic dissonance that doesn't actually really look. We talk about these stories and we see a kid with a teddy bear and that's all like sort of like self-gratifying for us, but maybe not that meaningful.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you very much. I think we've come to the the end of our time today. Apologies to Annalisa. I don't think we've quite got time for your question. But if I could ask the audience, there is a QR code for the feedback form on the last slide. So please just takes a minute or so to complete that. It's very helpful for us. Thank you once again, Anna, for this rich discussion. And finally, just to say thank you very, very much for joining us. And we'll now be closing the event.
Thank you. Thank you, Alison, and thank you everyone for listening.